to go ahead and get started. This is Megan Ademeyer with the Clallam Conservation District. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're excited to have Cathy Lucero speaking for us this year. Normally, we actually go out in the field and do this out in the pasture and look at fresh weed specimens, and it's usually a lot of fun to go and do that. But with COVID this year, we're just super happy to have Cathy doing this webinar for us with some excellent pictures. So for those of you that don't know Cathy, she has been the coordinator for the Clallam County Noxious Weed Control Board since 1997. So she knows all the weeds we have in Clallam County like the back of her hand, and is very happy to help educate anyone who needs some identification of weeds with what they have. So with that, Cathy, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and feel free to put questions in the chat box as Cathy gives her presentation, and she'll try to answer them as we go. And if any of them get missed at the end, she's going to have some time to answer at that time as well. All right, thanks, Cathy.
Well, I hope everyone can hear me, and good afternoon. It's a beautiful day. Thanks for joining and sharing with us this afternoon. Hopefully we make it through. Zoom, of course, not like everybody, is not my favorite medium to give a talk. I'd much rather be showing you the plants and letting you get a sense of them, but we'll muddle through as best we can. So let's just get started. This is about a variety of poisonous plants to both people, pets, and things you might find in your pastures. And I try and focus on things that you might find locally. There are a million things out there that you could look up online to look for, but I tried to keep it to things you might actually encounter in our area. So some of the things that I'm going to talk about today is, exactly how do we get killed by plants? I want to talk about risk, because it's really important to me to not frighten people unnecessarily and let them feel that they are able to have some control over the risk that they might encounter. So I'm just kind of doing a couple things here to make my screen look better. I'm getting rid of that. And just talk briefly, I'll show you some things about the different types of poisons that there are, but I'm not going to go into depth about them. Again, books and books. I'm going to show you some of the local poisonous plants, which is kind of where I want to focus, and just kind of summarize with ways to avoid poisoning. I will say that I'm not going to talk about fungi or algae, and I will say I'm not a doctor, I'm not a veterinarian, I'm not a toxicologist, but I am a plant geek, so I spend a lot of time, unfortunately, thinking about plants one way or another. So let's get started. One of the first questions, you might wonder is like, why are these plants toxic? What purpose does that serve? And let's think about it in terms of evolution. You might think about not insects per se coming to mind first thing, but just things grazing on them or eating them or breaking them or whatever. But really, most of the plants develop these toxins to prevent the munchers or something eating them up. And at the same time, quite a dilemma, many of them rely on an insect to visit to help with pollination and to spread their progeny around. So it's a bit of a dilemma for plants. And it's interesting. They've actually recorded the sound of insects chewing on leaves and then played them for animals, played them for the plants, and plants actually start to produce chemicals to deter the insects merely by hearing the sound of the munching. So they are that attuned, and it's always been a long-running warfare, how to attract just the right kind of customers and keep the others away. And that's really important as we talk about poisonings, because we'll take something that's not a broadleaf or a flowering plant in the sense that we think about it. It is a flowering plant, but this is a grass head that's in flower. Not something you'd really recognize. I bet you most of the time you wouldn't notice a grass flowering. However, your allergies would notice. And all the grasses are wind pollinated. They don't actually rely on a pollinator to come to them. So they, in general, don't produce the same amount of toxins. They don't attract the same insects. And a lot of times, grasses just aren't toxic. There are very few that are. And how does that play out for things that we're going to talk about today? Well, it plays out very strongly in which animals are more likely to be poisoned, just like the insects that might have evolved to deal with the chemicals that the plants are putting out to keep them away, so do animals that have been exposed to them over time have either become more tolerant or had other defenses. So for example, the difference between a browser and a grazer. So actually here's a goat with horsetail in its mouth. Not sure that that's all that great for it. However, goats are a lot more tolerant. They spend a lot more time browsing, picking around. They have to look for their food. It's not just big oceans of grass versus a grazer. And the grazers are actually less tolerant because they've evolved less mechanisms to deal with the chemicals that the plants are putting out. The other factor that can play into it strongly of which animals might be poisoned are one stomach versus two. Those with two stomachs often can be more tolerant because they have ways to digest those chemicals that the one stomachers don't. So we'll keep that in mind as we go farther along. But let's just talk about plants and what people have known about them forever. People have long relied on plants for not only food, but their pharmacopoeia, their medicines as well. And they've known exactly what was around that they could use. And they've been used to deliberately poison through the ages, sometimes secretly, like Lucretia Borgia was famous for carrying poison in her ring, or knowing the secrets of plants to her enemy's disadvantage, or even things like political gadfly Socrates, the poisoning with poison hemlock was a classic way to get rid of political people you didn't want. So plant properties and their uses were well known forever. That's how people survived. But since then, we've come to, I mean, think of children not exactly knowing what the plant that they're eating looks like when it's outside. We know less about them. Fewer people are living close to the land. And just remember that dose is everything. Remember I said it was not only their food, but their pharmacopoeia as well. So a lot of our medicines actually come from chemicals, plant chemicals, that are carefully used to do something good for us, help us. So I really want to stress this piece about, is it medicinal or is it poisonous? And toxicity really depends on the properties of the plant. I have to move this aside a little bit, see if I can see my presentation. Oops, I went a little too fast there. How toxic it, whoops, sorry about that. Every compound can be toxic if the exposure is high enough. And different species, whether they're old or they're young, are they healthy, or are they not healthy, we all know that things like stress can play a role in how healthy you are. Same with toxicity. And poisoning kind of has two aspects to it. It can be an acute dose where you just get enough, reaches a specific threshold, and bang, that individual dies. Or it can be something that can be eaten over a long period of time, and they suffer and then eventually die. So there's all sorts of different kinds of ways to look at toxicity. But the really important thing for us to remember as we're dealing with it in the practical means is, what's the risk? And the risk has not only to do with how toxic that thing is, but whether you're exposed to it or not. For example, I love this example of electricity. Everybody knows it's very, very dangerous, scares the heck out of me trying to wire something. You want to make sure it's off, and yet we use it safely every day, because when it's mechanically kept away from us and we're not touching it directly, it's perfectly safe. But if once you touch it, it can actually kill somebody very easily. So that exposure is a really critical piece to keep in mind. So toxicity is something that we can know about a plant, but we can manage the exposure, and that's the best way to minimize the risk. And I will also say that an allergy is different than toxicity. For example, poison hemlock, very poisonous plant if you eat it, but I have found that the more and more I get around that plant, I feel like I've developed some allergies to it. I get a sore throat, I get a headache, and I think it's mainly me becoming more sensitive to, in an allergic sense, not an actual toxicity. So I'm not actually eating it, but I'm still feeling some effects from being around it. And that's an individual response, not just toxicity. So there are lots and lots of different kinds of poisons. Some of the bigger groups are the alkaloids and the glycosides. Some of the smaller groups, rare, less common, are metal binding substances, alcohols, proteins, phototoxins, terpenes, nitrate, nitrite. There are many, many different ways of being poisoned, and the list goes on. But generally, plants have certain main categories of poisons in them and certain responses that you'll have to them, but often they're not simple. They may have multiple different types of toxicity. It just depends on the plant. But alkaloids, a lot of the plant families that really have a lot of alkaloids that you might be worried about are things in the aster family. That would be like sunflowers, daisies, chrysanthemums. The spurge family, things like poinsettias. Legumes, lily, poppy, buttercup, you can read the list. But those are the ones that tend to have alkaloids in them that are going to be potentially toxic. They're often very bitter. Animals don't tend to eat them if they get a choice, but sometimes it doesn't take very much for them to succumb to a poison. Glycosides are another one that are pretty common, that big group. And usually they're called glycosides because they contain a sugar molecule and it's combined with this other molecule that's going to be toxic. And when it's digested, it breaks the sugar off, and then you're exposed to the poison. So things like cyanide, you've heard of cyanide poisoning. Mostly that's found in the rose family, like in apricot pits and apple seeds and some other things. The goitogenic ones are mostly in the mustard family. Think of a lack of iodine, that people were getting goiters back in the day. That was a big deal. And it was mustards tend to impact your ability to uptake iodine, and you can have these other symptoms. Cardiactive, things like foxglove or some of the plants in the lily family. Saponins are not one that's very common. They're really bitter, they're kind of soapy, and hopefully use them as fish poisons. Coumarin are things in the carrot family and legumes, like poison hemlock is in the carrot family. And protonemonin is in the buttercup family, and it causes like a blistering and a burning of the mouth. There are lots and lots and lots. I'm not going to get into too much depth. You could read about these more, but I'm going to try and give you at least one example of each of these plants, because there's one of each of these in our county. So again, the list goes on: alcohols, proteins, things that you're going to find in horsetail and bracken ferns, phototoxins. There are a number of plants that have phototoxins that can cause rashes and severe burns. Terpenes are things that often cause a burning, and the nitrate, nitrite are almost exclusively ruminants. It's a curious function of the way they process food that turns these things into a poison. So the question is to eat. Here we have miner's lettuce, highly edible, lovely, just like the juiciest lettuce you could ever have, or not to eat. And here's a sprig of poison hemlock in case you've never seen it. I really wish I could show you one in person. So here's an old Calvin and Hobbes, and Calvin is out with Hobbes, and he's complaining about an assignment from the teacher. He says, the teacher didn't believe my leaves were from an alien planet. She just won't admit it was a pointless project. Who cares about leaves? What useless knowledge? And Hobbes says, I believe that's poison sumac you're holding. And my point being that the first step to knowing about poisoning is knowing what you're dealing with. And there are so many wonderful books out there. These are just a few that I routinely use, and there are certainly more. And nowadays there are lots and lots of great websites. I advise you to go to a reputable one, a university, or a veterinary medicine site to get your information, because there's not always great information, as I'm sure you're well aware. So let's just jump right into some of the plants we're going to talk about. Poison hemlock, an early plant that we're after. We've been out treating this in a number of places in the county. It's got small white flowers, kind of like an umbrella-shaped flower head. Its previous family name was umbellifera. They've changed it to something else, unfortunately. But the key characteristic, when you look really close, I'm going to hold the cursor on, especially right here where you have a leaf blade join the main stem. There are no hairs anywhere on the plant. And you'll hear talk of the purple spots and purple splotches. Well, a lot of things have purple. I find that a difficult characteristic to be useful, but the best one I can tell you is no hairs anywhere on the plant. Problem with this plant is that it's toxic whether it's green, and when it's quite bitter, animals don't tend to eat it intentionally, but it can be poisonous, just as poisonous when it's dry and it's been bundled up in hay or some other way that they're getting into it, and they can't really taste it anymore and be warned off. It doesn't take very much to kill, and it can cause a number of things. Even if it doesn't kill an animal, a pregnant animal can definitely cause stillborn or deformed animals. I'm going to show you a picture. Here's more pictures of it. It's in the carrot family. You can see that gigantic root. That's actually my hand next to the root of this hemlock that we dug up. It had been probably mowed repeatedly, and it didn't kill it. It just got bigger and bigger, like the gargantuan poisonous carrot. And this is one of my crew members on the left. He's over 6 feet tall, and you can see that the plant can get very, very tall, but it starts out just as a small little clump of leaves. So it's kind of one of those things that once you have an eye for it, you can spot it, but we're going to walk through some of the lookalikes. But here's some of the things that can happen, especially when a pregnant mom eats just enough to cause paralysis while the fetus is still in utero. So for example, these are not calves that are playing with each other. They're actually, their limbs are frozen into place. They're deformed. This cow on the ground, his head is bent. They've got all these bent limbs. What happens is if the mother eats some at a critical time, normally the fetus is constantly moving inside, and that movement keeps the bones malleable and flexible. But if they're paralyzed for a brief period, their bones ossify, and they're born with a number of these deformities. If they're far enough along and the mother eats it, it can cause stillborn or just cause her to abort. This is a case where down by the Dungeness, down by the dike there where people frequently walk, there's quite a bit of hemlock down there, or there used to be, not very much anymore. And this whole pasture here had a lot of animals in it. And this is a little poison hemlock plant that's been run over a number of times. The farmer, I believe, he would put out bales of hay, I don't know, a big field, but sometimes he would put out hay and the animals would eat there. And when I called to tell him I'd found a pair of beautiful, full-term stillborn calves, and to tell him that there was hemlock in the field, he said, "Oh, I wonder where they were. I couldn't find them." And he'd lost several sets, but he still didn't think that poison hemlock had anything to do with it. And it was rampant all along the ditch line here. So we've had, I believe, poisonings here. Can't verify it without an autopsy, but I think it's a problem that we need to be careful about. So there are a number of things that look like it, and I'm going to point to one, the wild carrot, also known as Queen Anne's lace, another listed noxious weed, so is poison hemlock. And you can see, if you look carefully down here in this picture, that the stem has these kind of stiff hairs. And even when this plant is dry, you can feel that roughness on the stem. And this is the forerunner of our domestic carrot. So when you pull the root up, it's kind of a white root, but it smells just like carrot because it is a carrot. And when it forms its seed heads, they kind of look like this bird's nest. And the flower, the cluster of flowers is completely different than what you would see on a poison hemlock. And here's actually a native species that's commonly found in our ditch areas, water parsley. And you can see it doesn't really have carrot-like leaves in the same. You can see here's a carrot on the left, and here's water parsley. They're more compound, but not dissected again. So that's actually a very common plant. I don't know water parsley to be poisonous. I do know that wild carrot is mildly toxic. Usually animals just kind of avoid it if they can. So the most common thing, let's see if I can get rid of this shot here. The most common lookalike that people are certain that they have poison hemlock is this plant called burr chervil. And remember, I showed you on the poison hemlock stem the smooth, no hairs. Well, look how hairy it is right along the stem. And burr chervil tends to have long purple streaks, and even the hairs have the leaves have tiny little hairs on the back. It's all over. This one has a very pungent smell when crushed, and the leaves are actually usually a light green and a little bit rounded at the tips, but they look very, very similar. It's not, animals usually avoid it. It's not very tasty, but it isn't poisonous. So it's not the end of the world, but I do see this spreading a lot, which means that there's less forage for animals because they will avoid this. I do believe that if chickens eat this, their eggs will be flavored with it and give them an off flavor. So, and possibly milk if it's the same case. So not really a desirable plant. So if we could do a question for you, a questionnaire, could you tell these two plants apart? And I wish I could ask you in person, but this plant on the left is the Queen Anne's lace, or the wild carrot. It just looks like a carrot top. And this one is poison hemlock. They look very, very similar when they're close together, and or even apart when you don't have something to compare it with. So and I'm going to continue with some of the lookalikes because it's pretty important, this one. So another very, very poisonous plant, which I am told exists in Clallam County. I have never personally seen it in my life, so it's pretty rare, but it's considered the most poisonous plant in all of North America. And unlike the little close-knit head of white flowers, this one has little pom-poms of umbrella of little white flowers. One of the little childhood rhymes that there's a number of species that kind of look like this plant, and they say, if you look at the veins that are on a leaf, and if it's midline, so the vein coming from the midline to the tip of the leaf, everything's hip. Mid-leaf to tip, everything hip. Midline to cut, that means where the leaf goes down. I'm losing my cursor. Down in here, pain in the gut. And that's the way you can tell this from a number of other species. Incredibly toxic. A mouthful is enough to kill. And even the sap is problematic. Animals rubbing their heads on the ground on the sap. Again, very rare, so you have to be exposed to it, but it does exist and it's supposed to be in Clallam County. You just haven't seen it. And I'm going to mention lupins because Megan had a question about lupins and letting animals graze on them. It's true that not all lupins are poisonous. I did a little bit more research on this before coming in. At least 6 species are, and I've kind of listed them down by their common name down in this corner, but they can hybridize and it can be very difficult to tell apart. And for the most part, it's better to avoid them. So the toxins that they have are similar to the poisoning that you'd get from poison hemlock, that paralysis, convulsions, or unthriftiness, or that crooked calf disease that we saw earlier. It doesn't take very much for these to be toxic. So yet another carrot that looks like poison hemlock, actually I think even more similar because the leaves look so much more similar. Darker green than burr chervil and kind of pointed. But again, when you look at it, it's just kind of lightly fuzzy all over. It kind of looks like a stalk of celery on some level, that kind of consistency. And there's a purplish tinge to the stems. Now this one isn't poisonous, but it is listed as a noxious weed because it holds so much moisture and can be so prolific in a field. If it gets bound up in the hay often goes moldy. It's very, very difficult to dry it appropriately to keep from getting fungal problems that are not something you're going to want. And this is very, very prevalent in Jefferson County, getting to be less so, I hope, as they start to work on the roadsides. I'm not sure I included an impact shot of how bad this plant is. I've seen it once in Clallam County, and I hope it does not make it here from Jefferson because they have it so bad. And so here's that wild chervil again. If you look out into it and see just a little bit of fuzz, kind of like celery ridges on it, compared with that smooth poison hemlock. So here's your test again. Can you tell these apart? So wild chervil here on the top, see the little bit of fuzziness, and the poison hemlock, kind of pointy leaves at the end. This kind of a darker green than the burr chervil, Burr Sherwood will be a little more rounded at the end. And I'm going over this in great detail because we get so many calls and concerns about poison hemlock, and often you'll have them growing together, and I'll see the different one, and once I show people, they are immediately an expert. It doesn't take much, but I just want to give you something to work with. Let's talk for a minute about tansy ragwort. You probably heard about it. I'm just going to see where I am here. You've probably heard about tansy ragwort. It's known for causing irreversible liver damage in animals. But what does it look like? Again, there's lots of DYCs, as they call them, darn yellow composite flowers. So it looks like a yellow daisy where the heads open up altogether, and there's usually between 10 or 15 yellow petals. And the reason they call this a composite is that each of these, what we call petals, are actually a complete flower. So this is called a ray flower, and these are called disc flowers. And when tansy ragwort finally goes to seed, which it makes lots and lots, the ones that are ray and long, they form a little parachute and they fly off to distant places, and the little disc ones just fall near the parent plant. And these seeds, each plant can make up to 250,000 seeds, and it can last for 20 years in the soil waiting for the right chance to start. It doesn't look like much when it begins. It just looks like this little ruffle. See how ruffly the leaves are? They're kind of wrinkled. Looks like a little ruffly rosette in the ground, and then the second year it makes a stalk, goes to flower, and then to seed, and makes lots of problems. This is a farm out in Joyce where they have about 80 acres of tansy ragwort, and we've been working on them with it because the neighbors are tired of having it float into their land, and they've lost a number of animals, and it's not a nice thing. This is a chronic problem. It doesn't kill an animal immediately. It accumulates over time, and here's how it works. It combines with a liver enzyme to cause something similar to cirrhosis of the liver. And once that starts to happen, it can't be undone. So just like people can operate with a cirrhosis of the liver, so can animals for a period of time, unless they get an acute dose that finally throws them over the edge, or they're just not very healthy over time. It causes a lot of painful symptoms if they just have a chronic dose. It's a pretty terrible way to go. So this is one that's also like poison hemlock. Sorry, I just got to get these things off of here. Like poison hemlock, it is poisonous, whether it's green or whether it's dry. And more likely, animals are going to be poisoned when it's in the hay and they can't taste anymore because it's pretty bitter. They'll eat, as these animals have, they'll eat all around it, which lessens the competition of the grass with the plant, and tansy's doing just fine, thank you very much. Another thing to consider, not just horses or cows or pigs, but bees can pass the taint from tansy ragwort into honey. And if you consume honey that's been tainted with tansy ragwort, then you can have your liver poisoned as well. So a pregnant animal or a milking animal that's eating this can pass it through her milk into the young animal, who's going to be more susceptible than the grown animal. So this is a serious problem. We have a lot of places, and we're working on it. It's control, as Megan's going to talk about in pasture management, and I'll talk about later. Control is relatively reasonable. You just have to keep after it. Let's go to the next one. Now it won't move. Come on. There we go. Another plant that people don't consider very much, and this is not necessarily a common pasture problem, but it's more like a garden problem, unless you're buying hay from Eastern Washington, where as they switch over their fields from one crop to a next, often this plant, common groundsel, will come up, and it's closely related to tansy ragwort. It's just a different species, and you can see instead of opening up to a daisy-like flower, they stay closed like this. There's another one called woodland groundsel, and actually common groundsel, as small and diminutive as it is, has more chemicals in it than tansy ragwort does. And this is the plant that caused all the damage. Gosh, it's going to go on to 15 or 20 years ago in Chimicum, where a farmer had bought inexpensive hay, fairly weedy hay, where they had done a first cutting, and there was a lot of common grounds. Well, he lost most of his herd to tansy, the poisoning that you can get from tansy ragwort. So again, poisons, whether it's green or dry, pretty small, usually not something you're going to see in a healthy pasture, but in those bare areas where, and I'm seeing it on the roadsides a lot now, in your garden, you're going to see this plant. It's an annual, it goes to seed very, very quickly, and it can make multiple generations in one season. It's very adventitious, opportunistic, I should say. So what do I want to say about this? Probably nothing more, just to know that there are a number of things in this category that have the same types of poisoning. Let's move on to the nightshades. Oh, joy. Nightshades do have a terrible reputation with good reason, and we are seeing more and more of this show up. So I had never even really seen it in the county, but it's like a little tomato plant, and they get these nice little white flowers on them, a tomato or a potato plant that you didn't plant, and then they develop these green berries. And there's black nightshade and there's hairy nightshade. Black nightshade would turn blackberries, and this little structure here called the calyx would come farther down on the berry. You can see this little hairy, incredibly poisonous. It takes as little as 1 to 0.3% of body weight. So for example, about 2.5 ounces for 150 pounds of body weight to kill. And there are a variety of different nightshades. This one's bittersweet nightshade, which is more vining, and it unfortunately turns into this just absolutely luscious looking red berry, and you'll often see it twining among other berries. Usually likes a wet environment, so we see this coming in along some of our stream corridors. But the hairy nightshade, quite a bit of it in squim, likes sandy soils. Think of strawberry fields. This is where I saw quite a bit of it, in the strawberry fields, where this little annual was coming up in between the rows. So you got to watch out for this one. I think we've had a number of poisonings from this plant because people just weren't aware of what it was, and the seeds persist for a long time. I actually brought it to my yard. I got some really nice horse manure that had been decomposed way out in the back of a horse arena. They hadn't used it for like 8 years. I dug it up, transplanted it to an area I was going to plant a lawn, and lo and behold, it all came up hairy nightshade. Shocking. And I just had to hand pull it all and get it out of there, even though I wasn't going to be eating any of those berries. But just be aware of the nightshades. St. John's wort is actually pretty prevalent in squim. It favors a dry environment versus the wetter that we have out in the West End, but as we get drier summers, it's showing up there more. And this plant has an ancient history as a medicinal plant. Its Latin name, Hypericum perforatum. Hypericum comes from hyper icon. It was so amazing medicinally that they placed it over their icons, hyper meaning above. And so this little plant, also known as Klamath weed, the perforatum piece comes from, if you look at this leaf, it's fairly round, they're pretty small, and if you hold it up to light, you'll see these little, looks like pinpoints that prick through. That's where the hypericin is located in the leaf, and that's what's often been used more recently for antidepressant. So down in California, this was called Klamath weed, one of the few things that could grow in some of the more barren areas, and boy, the cows did, and they died in droves. It was so bad that back in the 40s, if you had this plant on your land, the banks wouldn't even lend you money on it because it was worthless. What it does is it prevents animals from disposing of excessive chlorophyll, and they start to sunburn. You know, chlorophyll is what's used to capture the sunlight. So it's a phototoxic. It causes this hypersensitivity to sunlight, blistered skin, all sorts of things can happen. They might be very happy cows, but dead cows nonetheless. I'm going to give you an example. You can avert your gaze if you don't like to look at something like this. This is what happens to light-skinned animals when they get into too much of it. This is a hypersensitivity when they're light-skinned, or where there is no fur covering. In California, what happened to those animals, they became so sunburned that their skin sloughed off and they died of secondary infections. It was terrible, terrible, terrible. So we do have it. It certainly is a dose issue. They can eat it safely for a bit, but it's something to be aware of, especially light-skinned animals. So the mustards, who would think that a happy little mustard could be a problem? We eat lots and lots of mustard, one of my favorite condiments. However, they actually have a whole bunch of toxins in them, and there are certain diseases that can come from too much mustard in the diet. And you can see how densely, this is a lot in Port Angeles. Shockingly, we almost never have mustard like this. Most of it grows in squim, where we grow some of the best Brassicaceae. Anything in the mustard family grows very, very well in squim, but it's rapidly moving from squim into Port Angeles and making its way out to the West End. So there's lots and lots of different types. Very edible. Dose is everything. Usually, if I'll go back up a picture here, I don't have a really good picture, but usually there's 4 petals, and they're in what they call the shape of a Maltese cross, like this. Often denotes a mustard characteristic, and they sometimes nitrate poisonings, and the glycosides that we talked about earlier can cause anemia, thyroidism, kidney and liver disease, blindness, photosensitivity, lots and lots of different problems. But one in particular for horses when they're in late spring colts and they eat too much of this, something called dysmaturity. And here's an example of it. It causes a real problem with ossification of their bones. They get something called monkey jaw. There's a number of diseases that this plant can cause. And you'd be surprised how much mustards are showing up in pastures. It's certainly areas where the grass isn't very healthy, where the ground is open. So I'm just looking at the time here because I can go on, and I have lots of stuff to tell you about. So some of the clovers can also cause some of this photosensitivity as well. Alsike clover and red clover. It's not the pink one that we see around that much, but it's more there really is a red. It's a brilliant red. It's very beautiful. Sometimes people plant it as an ornamental, and actually in this case, it's more from a fungal disease that's happening that causes the problem. And there's another kind of clover called sweet clover, which is showing up more and more, especially in the Dungeness. It used to show up. We didn't have a lot, but I probably saw it 10 or 15 years ago show up on roadsides, and it's actually moving rather swiftly. And I'm going to show you another slide more closely of the sweet clovers. They get quite tall. Gosh, they can be anywhere from just a couple feet to 5, 6, 7 feet tall. They come in 2 flavors, a white one or a yellow one. And interestingly, this is the plant that they discovered warfarin from. So if any of you take the blood thinner Coumadin or warfarin, this is the plant that's derived from, or plants that produce this kind of toxin. And they found it from animals, loved it, they ate it, but they started to thin their blood and they would bleed to death, and if they got nicked or anything. So certainly spreading, and again, about dose, something you want to be aware of and careful with. So slavamine poisoning is often associated with clover, pasture, and hay, and so it's this excessive slavering. Anyway, there's lots of things that these plants can cause, and you can read more about them later. So foxglove, gosh, they're so pretty, and there are certainly a lot of ornamental colors that you can buy. And man, these things spread like an amazing amount of seed and come up everywhere. We're seeing more and more of it out in our West End. People actually collected it for the cardiac. Now it's escaping me the name of it, but this is what people take for heart problems, heart conditions. But dose is everything, and if an animal is out there eating this plant, which I believe is quite bitter, but again, when you don't have a healthy pasture, this stuff can show up, and animals left to their own devices can find a way to eat something that they shouldn't be eating. So again, not always introduced species, although most of the things we've talked about are. Pacific bleeding heart, there are a number of native species that are also poisonous. So this one, if anyone of you are familiar with Herb Robert, the bleeding heart or Dutchman's breeches, I don't know why this guess looks like little pantaloons. But this one's actually quite toxic as well. And animals that are out in kind of woodlots grazing underneath those might find something like this to chew on, and its toxicity doesn't take a lot to eat, a plant to be avoided. This is a pretty common one in a lot of our fields, and actually gardeners hate this plant as well. Horsetail, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, and bracken fern. And actually in cows and horses, they cause different issues. One has to do with thiaminase poisoning, where they're not getting, it's a protein poison, and they're not able to get enough thiaminase out of their food and can cause all sorts of problems. People often collect some of the ferns for when they're young, the fronds to boil and eat. They are associated with a certain kind of cancer, and so probably not really a good thing to eat in excess. Also another one that's poisonous when it's dry or when it's green. This case takes quite a lot for animals to eat it and for them to be poisoned, and usually when you take them off, they will recover nicely, but it's often a sign in the case of horsetail that it's rather wet. In bracken fern, kind of tells you that the pasture isn't very fertile, the soil's pretty thin, and it's already struggling, and so you're going to get these plants coming in. Both are native species, both are not desirable forage for your animals, and can actually cause some pretty serious disease, a B1 deficiency in this case, and it's kind of a weird picture that I found where the nervous system has degenerated and causes all sorts of peripheral limb degeneration and bleeding. It's a little nasty. So not something you really want for your animals. Oops, I think I already covered St. John's wort. Looks like I got it in here twice. Sorry about that. And here's something that's super common. And I mentioned I did not used to think about this being really that much of a problem, but common cat's ear is actually a big problem, and we have lots of it. And it looks a lot like other things. There's a number of, again, darn yellow composites that look just like this. But this one, as you can see, is pretty hairy and lies pretty flat to the ground. And if you see what you're calling dandelions out right now, those are indeed dandelions. The stems are hollow. The leaves are fairly upright. Dandelion's a good forage in your pasture of all the things that have been introduced, full of vitamins, very edible, but that's not cat's ear. So cat's ear has been associated with severe laminitis, something called string halt, and I believe that it's actually fairly prevalent in this area because we have so much cat's ear. It's the one that you're going to see when it's the last green thing in your pasture. And here's a little bit of cat's ear. When these stems come up, there's a single yellow flower on it, but they're very wiry. They are not hollow, and these are very stiff and they're very bitter. So not desirable. Again, it all comes down to the health of your pasture and your ability to keep these things out. This is a dandelion leaf. See how thinner, it's a little bit hairy, but it's not as stiff and severely hairy as the cat's ear, which lies flat. I'm just going to mention in passing dock. There's a couple of kinds of dock, and this is one of those, can be oxalic acids problems or nitrate problems. Pretty common, especially in wet clay-like soils and deep taproot. So one to be avoided if you can. Redroot pigweed, this is a big one, very, very edible plant, but a big nitrite problem, as well as the oxalates. And all parts, fresh or dry, are poisonous for especially cattle. Oops. So the vetches, things in the pea family. People have planted vetches all the time as a good cover crop to add nitrogen to their soils, but not really very healthy for your animals. And they can cause something called lathrism, which affects the skeletal structure. And I've heard of poisonings in Jefferson County when they got too much of this plant. And everlasting peavine or sweet peas are definitely toxic, but everlasting peavine was widely planted as erosion control, and they thought it would be a good forage. Absolutely not for your animals out in the pasture. tall fescue. And remember I said that most of the time grasses are not poisonous. Well, generally it's not the grass, and for a long time people avoided this plant because they thought the grass was toxic, but it turns out that it's a fungal problem. And you can see this little thing that looks like a little bit like a mouse turd in the head of this piece of grass, and that's the part that's toxic. And it can cause a number of different problems. It has to do with mold and mildew and this fungal disease. Most of the modern grasses have been designed to not be susceptible to this kind of thing. But tall fescue had long been associated with some problems with pregnant animals and things like that. So just real quickly, I'm going to run through some of the mechanical problems that will go back to irritants, rashes, mechanical injuries. So things of the skin, not necessarily things that you ingest. And here we have, again, one of my staff up over above Port Angeles, looking down into the harbor, where this beautiful golden, huge ornamental plant is growing, giant hogweed. And it is spectacular ornamental, but it is one of the nastiest things if you get it on your skin. And I'm super pale, as you can probably tell, and I would be very, very susceptible to the phototoxicity of it. It's actually activated by ultraviolet light and does such severe burning. This little boy got into some of it in a park in King County and nearly lost an eye because he was playing with it and rubbed the juice around his eye. And he recovered, and we're happy to hear that. But this is a plant that definitely causes toxicity. We have a native one called cow parsnip, very, very common, much shorter. It's got a little bit of hair on the back of it. Its Latin name, lanatum, means woolly, unlike the giant hogweed, which is very smooth and very deep. Giant leaves, they can get like 5 feet across. They're huge compared with our native. This too can cause some of that burning, but not to the degree that the giant hogweed does, as well as some of the others. So spurge laurel is another one that I hadn't paid much attention to. It's a very old-fashioned ornamental plant, really, really nasty sap, and actually really, really hard to kill. And we're seeing more of it. Squim in particular has quite a bit of it, and it's very shade tolerant, so we're seeing it grow in our woodland areas, and sometimes people have animals grazing in there, but this plant kind of looks like a funny rhododendron. Somehow there's something off about it. It's kind of shiny, shows up in the middle of nowhere. I don't know why that plant's there. Grows into quite a nice shrub, but very, very toxic sap. Can cause contact blindness and severe dermatitis at the same time. Petty spurge, here's another little weed that you might encounter in your yard. Same sort of thing, that sap, contact blindness. And you have to be really careful. It has this little milky latex that comes out when you break the stem. And I had a man come into the extension office who stopped in to say, my wife got into something, and he brought the plant. He said, she can't see, I'm taking her to the hospital. And she had gotten some of this petty spurge. So it's something that's real, so you should always handle these plants with care. English ivy, who would have thunk? But again, it has a lot of things in it, and it too has some dermatitis issues, something that animals shouldn't be eating, something that should be kept away from them, and often crawling in from your residential area into the pastures. Poison oak. We don't have much of this in the county. There's some at Lake Crescent, some out at Claylock. And I'm very familiar with it because I was originally from California many, many years ago, and I was so allergic to this plant that my eyes would swell shut. But it's got this shiny, looks like an oak leaf, super shiny. Be careful. It persists on surfaces that you wouldn't expect it to be in. Stinging nettle, you're all pretty familiar, and I'm going to rush through some of these because I know my time is going to start to get short here, and I want to give you a little time for questions if you want. But this is formic acid that's coming in this form of these little hairs that are so sharp, they inject the formic acid into your skin. And even though they're highly edible if you boil them, and that breaks up the formic acid so that you can eat them safely. Buttercups, super common, especially in these areas where it's really wet. In your lawn, they're certainly problematic, but out in a pasture. And this one is not one that's poisonous when it's green, when it's dry, only when it's green, and animals generally avoid it after they've tasted it because it blisters inside of their mouth because it burns them, and they learn pretty quickly not to eat it. It is not toxic when it's dry, only when it's green. But let's talk about some of these grasses that may not poison you per se, but certainly can cause a lot of problems because of this little structure called an awn. And it's like a spike at the end of this floret. Again, these are the flowering heads that turn into what we would recognize as wheat or grain. And a lot of times, again, when I was a kid, I worked for a veterinarian in California, and we had a lot of foxtail. We have very little foxtail here. It's more something called hair barley. But often the awns would get into between the dog's legs and travel all the way up their leg and have to do surgery to get them out. Could travel as far as the heart, but even more frequently up their noses, in their ears, puncture eardrums. And it's not just that, a dog, but also animals that are forced to eat this in their hay. This is an animal that had severe abscessing because of some of the long awns and the grains and the hay that they were eating. That's hay that's too mature. It shouldn't have those heads on it with those sharp awns. That's a problem. So something to be aware of when you purchase. And I will just want to say that many, many house plants and garden plants are toxic. And again, when we talk about exposures and how to keep your animals safe, keep them away from these things. Kids are bad enough, but animals don't always know better. And we have many, many deadly things around our house. We just aren't going around eating them. So when is poisoning most likely to occur? When they're children or when they're young animals. Certainly the dose that they need to have a symptom or a bad experience is lower than when they're bigger and an adult. If they're sick or they're not in good conditions. And things like cats versus, because they're carnivores, often lack the enzymes to break down certain poisons. Remember we were talking about grazers versus browsers. Well, those browsers had to survive experimenting with many, many things, and a lot of those plants had chemical defenses that they had to deal with. And those animals are better at it. So you get things like carnivores that aren't exposed to any of those things and have very, very low tolerance. So the browsers have evolved to tolerate a lot more toxins. Let me get some of these things off my screen. Okay. And the higher risk is when they're hungry or they don't have a good diet and they're trying desperately to appease some want that they have. If they're bored, and frankly, not every animal is smart. I can say that, but it's true. And some are just stupid and they just don't know, or they haven't been taught by their parents. So an animal that has been out in the open and exposed to the same plants and watched their parents, what they ate, learned a lot about how to stay safe. So horses picketed near ornamental plants while you run in to go to the bathroom, that's a problem. They start eating the bush because they're just bored and they're sitting there waiting. Or cattle in an overgrazed pasture are much more likely to, trying to get that off of there, to get poisoned. So whenever you maintain a good nutritious diet, the animals are happy, they're occupied, they're familiar with their surroundings, are less likely to be poisoned. So what should we do? I want to just circle back to this piece about being poisoned, not to alarm you that you got to run out and see if your animals are going to be poisoned. Remember that formula. It is risk equals the toxicity that is inherent in the plant and the exposure that the individual has. And really your best chance is to manage that exposure. You have a lot of control over that. Know those plants out in the place where you're going to put your animals. Know the forage and teach your children never to eat anything that you haven't approved of. Children who learn very young what they could eat and what they couldn't eat. But a lot of children haven't had that experience. And go out and learn what's out there. Identify what's possibly poisonous. Get rid of it, especially around the edges where they'll keep coming in from people who have a different land management perspective. Wear gloves when you're weeding or handling or even pruning ornamental plants. And when an animal is new to an area, introduce them slowly. Make sure they're safe where they're going to be, because you can't expect them to know. And that pasture management piece, Megan's going to talk about that next week, is absolutely critical. It's the whole key to all of it. Make sure that the animals have an adequate diet. Don't let them overgraze an area. That encourages weeds to take over. And check on your animals or confined animals. They don't always know. They don't always have choices. Sometimes they're bored. One case of poisoning occurred in an animal that was in an arena and was there quite a bit of time and had a lot of nightshade along with lamb's quarter, which is highly palatable. And while they were waiting, they were just eating and died. So make sure that people who come in contact with your animals know too. You don't want them feeding them tulip bulbs or daffodil bulbs because it's pretty and the horsey wants something to eat. So that's something to be aware of, because it can happen. And especially check where animals are temporarily left while you go do something real quick, because you might have something there that they shouldn't be exposed to. So knowing your hay field is really important. Where is your feed coming from? And maybe wildlife poisonings. Can wildlife be poisoned by a poorly managed area that's letting the weeds come in? So knowing your hay, making sure you've seen the field, or you've learned, and I think Megan's probably going to touch on that, about how to assess the hays that you're buying. Ask for weed-free certified hay. So if your animal is poisoned, you can call or you or a person, or you can call poison control. You can get your animal checked, but make sure you're prepared to describe the symptoms. Did it happen right away? Was it gradual? Was it intermittent? Did it change over time? They'll want to know things like what species of animal. Collect any suspicious samples. It could be something completely different. Just because the animal was next to something didn't mean they ate it. So you just have to do your best. And one of my gurus, my favorite person of all to ask, is Dr. Patricia Talcott. She's a veterinary toxicologist at the University of Idaho. She's amazing. I've been in contact with a couple of locals here who've been having animal poisonings locally, and I've advised them to go to Patricia, and she has been always gets back to them quickly and keeps them informed. So just make sure you're aware of your surroundings. Check it out. Be informed. Learn. So I'm going to stop there and ask if people have any questions, or we'll end it here.
That was excellent, Cathy. I think that you covered so much stuff that probably everyone's just still trying to process that. So that was excellent. I always learn so much from your presentations and really appreciate all the knowledge that you have.
Well, that was my hope, that they were just stunned into silence, and they'll come up with a million questions that they'll ask you next week.
Or they'll wait and ask you on that third presentation we have of the top 12 weeds. So if anybody does want to unmute and ask a question, feel free to do that. We don't have to keep using the chat box, so we can unmute at this time. And thank you all for tuning in. We really appreciate your presence here in the live webinar. It's always nice. I know we're recording this as well, and we will send you the link to the recording, but it is always nice to have a live audience as well, so we know we're talking to someone when we do these. So next Monday,
you might mention what's coming. Oh, good. You're going to mention. Good. I was hoping you'd mention what's coming.
Yep. I was just going to say that next Monday, we'll have a talk on pasture and hayland management as a way to help control and prevent weeds from coming into the pastures. And then the following Monday, Cathy's going to be back with us from that same 3:30 to 4:45 time slot. And we're going to talk about control of the top 12. I think many of which you talked about today, Cathy, if I remember right.
Exactly. That's partly why I wanted to cover those, so we had things to talk about and reinforce why we don't want them.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly. So, unless anyone has any questions, Cathy, do you have anything more you want to add?
I look forward to listening in next Monday. I will listen in, so I make sure I'm all up to speed.
Fantastic. Yes, thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again next Monday. And like I said, I'll send you a link. And Cathy also gave us a really great document that I'll send along as well that talks about most of the things that she talked about today. So you have kind of a cheat sheet that you can have. So thank you, Cathy. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Always appreciate you. All right. Bye-bye,
Thanks.
everyone.